Bureaucratic negligence turned a federal aid program meant for hungry children into a $250 million slush fund. And the government's failure to act on some very clear warnings is, well, it's a scandal in itself.
Yeah.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are dissecting a critical special review that sheds a really harsh light on maybe the biggest example of pandemic-era taxpayer fraud we've seen. I'm talking about the massive $250 million scheme centered on the Minnesota nonprofit known as Feeding Our Future.
It's just a staggering figure, that $250 million.
It really is. And our mission today is to go beyond, the individual charges and figure out exactly which government processes broke down. How did this happen right under the noses of state regulators?
Right, because the U.S. Department of Justice has charged 70 individuals with financial crimes here. They were exploiting two key federal nutrition programs during the pandemic, the Child and Adult Care Food Program, or CSCFP, and the Summer Food Service Program. I mean, these were designed to feed vulnerable kids.
And that's the key. We're not just focusing on the criminals, but on the systemic failure of the government agency that was supposed to be watching the money. That's why we're diving into the findings of the Minnesota Office of the Legislative Auditor, the OLA.
Precisely. The OLA review concluded that this fraud, it wasn't just a case of individual greed overwhelming a good system. It was the Minnesota Department of Education, or MDE, whose, and this is their term, inadequate oversight, actually created the opportunity for the whole scheme.
So this deep dive is really about the mechanism of that breakdown. So let's preview the key things you, the listener, need to grasp. How does one organization's reimbursements surge by an unbelievable, 2,818% in a single year without anyone pulling the emergency brake?
And the implications here go way beyond just wasted money. This oversight failure is now tied to some pretty alarming allegations. The U.S. Treasury is apparently investigating whether some of this public welfare money might have even gone to a foreign terror group, Al-Shabaab.
Which takes this to a whole other level. It's not just bookkeeping. Okay, so let's unpack this from the start. Failures this big, they don't just happen overnight. Did the MDE have any indication at all that Feeding Our Future was a high-risk entity before the pandemic gave them cover?
Oh, absolutely. The warning signs weren't just flashing. They were basically glowing red for years. FOF was approved as a sponsor back in 2017. A sponsor is, the middleman between the government and the actual meal sites.
And the OLA found that they immediately became an anomaly.
A huge one. Even before COVID, so by the end of 2019, FOF had already enrolled more than 6 times the number of meal sites compared to the average sponsor in Minnesota.
6 times the average. That kind of outlier growth alone should trigger some kind of aggressive scrutiny, right?
You'd think so. And MDE even acknowledged the risk internally. Their staff raised numerous concerns during FOF's annual application reviews. They noted FOF lacked, qualified financial staff and just didn't seem to have the procedures to manage what was becoming millions of dollars.
So the paper trail of risk was already there. What was the biggest warning signal they got?
The direct complaints. MDE got at least 30 complaints about FOF or its sites between 2018 and 2021. And crucially, even before the pandemic started, MDE had already received an allegation that FOF had solicited a kickback from a vendor.
A kickback? So they had a credible report of actual criminal behavior. And yet FOF was allowed to keep operating.
Can keep receiving federal funds. Yes, They were understaffed, they were showing signs of corruption, and then the floodgates opened. And that brings us to the core number. The OLA found MDE's total payments to Feeding Our Future increased by about 2,818% between fiscal year 2020 and 2021.
2,818%. That's not growth. That's a statistical impossibility that should have frozen everything.
It should have. And the fact that the regulator didn't pause payments, didn't demand an audit, that is the essence of the oversight failure. And the OLA review details exactly how MDE failed. Let's look at the 3 main areas where the regulation just, it collapsed.
Okay, what was the first one?
The first was the application approval failure. Year after year, MDE staff would flag serious problems with FOF's applications capacity, staffing, controls. And year after year, MDE leadership just kept approving them.
I just don't get the logic. If your own staff says, this organization cannot handle this money, why does the agency approve the funding?
It seems to be a pattern of just processing paperwork over doing any real diligence. For example, in September 2012, MDE staff officially noted that FOF's lack of financial staff undermined their internal controls. the very thing that prevents theft.
And they approved the application anyway.
They approved their 2021 application anyway. Even after FOF failed to provide the follow-up info they'd asked for, they also just took FOF's word on huge operational claims, like that 80 different sites could prepare their own food they never checked.
Unbelievable. So that's the application failure. What about when the fraud allegations actually started coming in?
That brings us to the second, and I would argue the most shocking failure. The investigation failure. MDE assigned investigative duties to their regular child nutrition program staff.
Wait, to nutritionists? Not trained financial investigators.
Exactly. People trained in meal standards, not financial forensics. And their policy for handling complaints was, well, it was baffling. When a complaint came in, even one alleging kickbacks or misappropriation, MDE's procedure was to share the complaint with FOF and let FOF resolve it themselves.
Hold on. You're saying they told the suspected criminal to conduct their own investigation and then just report back on whether they were guilty?
That's the policy. The OLA highlighted a case from August 2021 where MDE referred a complaint about a kickback back to FOF for self-resolution. And we now know that the DOJ later charged the very individuals involved in that exact dispute. The policy basically guaranteed fraud would go unchecked.
So they proved high-risk groups and then delegated investigations to the fraudsters. What was the last line of defense they had?
That was the serious deficiency failure. Declaring an organization seriously deficient is the official tool to terminate bad actors and stop the money. MDE actually declared FOF seriously deficient on 2 different occasions.
So they used it.
They started to, but then they ultimately deferred or waived both of them. For instance, they accepted an audit from FOF in 2021 that was, get this, conducted by an unlicensed auditor and was missing required information. They just accepted it and didn't follow up to make sure any corrections were made. They had the power to shut them down, and every single time, they backed away.
So every safeguard was either ignored or bypassed, and then the COVID-19 pandemic hits, which just threw gasoline on the fire.
That's exactly right. The pandemic accelerated the collapse. Federal waivers offered flexibility, meal bundling and off-site distribution to get food to kids. But those waivers required state agencies to have a plan to ensure program integrity, to prevent fraud.
And let me guess, MDE didn't have one.
The OLA confirmed it. MDE never produced a formal written plan. MDE officials literally admitted they often had to rely on a sponsor's truthfulness.
And they were relying on the truthfulness of an organization they already suspected of soliciting kickbacks.
Yes. And all of this happened as the amount of money flowing through the system exploded. Funds to all nonprofit sponsors went up 382% in fiscal year 2021. And FOF just dominated that chaos.
How much?
In that 1 year, FOF took in roughly 4 out of every $10 distributed to all nonprofit sponsors in the entire state. This one high-risk organization was suddenly processing claims at a rate that was just impossible.
So what was MDE doing while this was happening? Were they scrambling to catch up?
The opposite. The OLA says MDE actively chose not to conduct a scheduled follow-up review in 2020, right when the risk was highest. Their reason was, and I'm quoting here, they said they could have done a desk review but wanted to do the full review, so we paused until the pandemic was over.
They paused monitoring at the exact moment the fraud was skyrocketing.
Exactly. That pause happened as FOF's claimed meals shot up by 7,104%. The moment of highest risk was the moment MDE decided to stop watching.
And that's the $250 million price tag of inaction. We know the DOJ has charged 70 people. The financial damage is clear.
And we should note, MDE's commissioner has defended the agency. He claims their oversight met the standards and that the blame lies with the indicted and convicted fraudsters. He also said they've since created an Office of Inspector General and updated their fraud policies.
But the auditor's report is pretty clear that the failure was systemic, and it has consequences that go far beyond Minnesota's budget.
And this is where the story gets much darker. The OLA report focused on the bureaucratic failure, but other sources outside that report indicate that the U.S. Treasury is now investigating something else. They're looking into whether some of this $250 million was funneled to the Somali terror group al-Shabaab.
If that's proven true, it creates a terrifying link. State-level negligence directly funding global terror.
It means dollars meant for hungry kids may have ended up in the hands of America's enemies. It's the worst-case consequence of letting government programs run without any real accountability.
So the central failure is definitive. This fraud was enabled by systematic deficiencies and ignored warnings. The RLA report has recommendations, of course. Stricter criteria, giving MDE subpoena power so they don't have to ask fraudsters to investigate themselves.
It's a profound lesson, really. When the agency decided to defer their duties to approve sketchy applications, they essentially opened an unsupervised bank vault. The scale of this proves that lax bureaucracy isn't just waste. It's a dangerous national liability.
Okay, so what does this mean for you, the listener? For all the other federal aid programs out there, MDE had the data, the authority, and the mechanisms to stop this, and they failed to use them for years.
It shows that when programs are built for speed, especially in an emergency, the lack of real-time critical oversight can turn charity into a criminal goldmine. The failure wasn't a lack of rules, it was a total failure of enforcement.
So here's the final thought for you to carry forward. If unchecked government programs can funnel $250 million to fraudsters and potentially fund international terror, what level of independent real-time oversight do all large federal aid programs truly require to make sure our tax dollars aren't just wasted, but actively protected? That is the standard we have to demand now.